In this video we're going to look at Leo's disco program, and basically what it is a JackBord with the light stick attached, and we have the top on it because we need the two buttons. So if I press the left button, it turns on the LEDs and sets them to a random color. So you can see here that every time I press the button we get a different color. And then the second button causes them to flash. And then while they're flashing I can press the left hand button to make the colors change. So what we'll do is look at how we can make this and how the program works. To build this we're going to need one charged JackBord, JackBord top, a light stick, one M4 nut and bolt, a 20cm female-female jumper wire, and 6 10cm female-female jumper wires. Right, so let's start by putting the top on top of the JackBord. Then we're going to connect pin 2 of button 1 to ground. And then we will connect pin A1 on port A to pin 1 of button 1. Next we'll connect pin 2 of button 2 to the ground pins, one of the ground pins on port E. And then we're going to connect pin C1 on port C to pin 1 of button number 2. So basically we have port pin A1 going into button number 1 pin 1, and then button number 1 pin 2 goes to ground. Over here we have port pin C1 connecting to button number 2 pin 1, and then button number 2 pin 2 goes to ground on port E. So the next thing we're going to do is connect the light stick. And to do this, first of all we want to make sure that we have, when it's gone onto port B, that the text is at the top like this. Okay, so you can see the text along here. So we're going to take the bolt, put it through, put that, and just bolt the light stick on. Going to do it hand tight. The next thing we need to do is connect the ground of the light stick. So we go from the ground pin of the light stick to ground on port B. Then we need 5 volts, so we're going to go from the 5 volt pin on the light stick to 5 volts on port B. And then finally we need the blue jumper, and we're going to go from the data in pin on the light stick to port pin E1, or the SLED port on port E. Check what you've done against these pictures. The one on the top left shows the connection to port pin A1 to button 1, and the one on the lower right shows the connection from port pin C1 to button 2. These pictures show the attachment of the light stick, and notice on the left that we bolted onto port B, and the JB light label on the light stick is facing upwards, and so the bolt is on the left. And then the picture on the right hand side shows the power connection, which is the red wire, the ground connection, which is the green one, and the data connection, which is the blue wire. The picture on the left shows the connection from the data in line of the light stick into port pin E1 on port E, and that's the blue jumper. And the green jumper is the ground connection from the button 2. And the picture on the right shows the finished unit, the finished disco light. So check your version against these ones and make sure that everything matches up. To get the code for this project, visit JB.works in your web browser. At the search prompt, enter the TMT code shown below and press enter. Once you see the code on the screen, click the Copy Code button, and this puts the code into the clipboard. Then go to the prog page and paste the code into the area you're working in. Right, let's have a look at the code. So the first thing we're going to do is set up some variables. So here we're setting up a variable called color, and that holds the color that all of the LED is going to be set to. This one is the brightness, and that's telling the system or telling the JackBord how bright we want the LEDs to be. And then this one tells us whether we're supposed to be flashing the LEDs or not. So basically 0 means no, don't flash, and 1 equals we need to be flashing. So now that we set up the variables, come down here to the program start, and we clear the screen, print a message. Now here's where we set up the LEDs. So we're telling JackBord that we've got 10 LEDs, we wait a bit, then we're telling it to turn them all off by setting all of their colors to 0, which is black. Next we set up the buttons, BTP A1. So what happens with this command is that when someone presses a button on A1, it will run a task called disco, which is this one here. Okay? And then when we press button on C1, it will call a task called flash. And if we come down to the bottom here, here is flash, and then flash will go ahead and toggle the flash state, whether we're flashing or not. So that now that we've set up the buttons, we are setting up the show page controls. So this line here basically prints the brightness there, and then this line here sets up the slider, which is what will control the brightness of the LEDs. And then that's it. We are finished with the program setup. So once we've done the setup, we're going to go into the program loop. And the first thing we want to do is to decide whether we're supposed to be flashing or not. So if I have a flash value that's equal to 1, then I'll come down here and I'll toggle the brightness. That's how it flashes. So the AND statement basically says if brightness is greater than 50, I'm going to set it to 10. But if brightness is less than 50, I'm going to set it to 100. And if neither one of these is valid, then it will just set it to 50. And that's why the LEDs don't go black and then the color, black then the color, because it's basically toggling the brightness from 10% to 100%. And then once we set the value of brightness, we come down here and use the SLED B, which is set the LED brightness command, to use that brightness value and set the brightness of the LEDs. And then we wait 100 milliseconds and go right up to the top and repeat the whole process again. So coming down to the disco task, the first thing it does is it generates a random number, which is this section here, between 1 and 15, and then it stores it in the color variable. And then the SLED or set LED command, 99, which means set all of the LEDs, and then it will use the color that we generated here. So every time you press the button on pin A1, remember we call the disco task, and that's what the disco task does. It basically changes the color of the LEDs. And then finally, the flash task is a toggle. So basically, if flash is equal to 0, then we're going to set it to 1. If flash is not set to 0, then, if it's not set to 0, which means that it's 1, we will set it to 0. Because we're already flashing, we want to stop flashing. And then it will just return. Now that we've had a look at the code, let's just go back and look at the robot. So if I press the start button, it will start up and it's showing red, and then I press it again and it changes color. So now it's kind of cyan, orange, yellow, blue. And then remember we also had the feature whereby if you pressed the button on port pin C1, it would start flashing. And then if I go back and push the button on port pin A1, it starts flashing a different color. So remember in the code, we set up the two buttons so that A1 would tell it that we want to change color, and C1 would tell us that we wanted to start or stop the flashing. And finally, you've got the brightness adjustment. So if I drag this all the way to the right, like this, it will get a lot brighter. And if I drag it all the way to the left, it gets a lot dimmer. And so this is how you can control the brightness of the LEDs. So have an experiment and see what you can do to change how the code works and to improve upon it. For more information, visit JB.works.